So Dr. Terrym Mortensonem, we just visited museum in this place a little bit, and we was in Ark yesterday. Well, it was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Really nice, and we very enjoyed this place. So that was a lot of work to create this museum, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. I didn't have much to do with it, but
yeah, we met another people from here who actually was involved in the building the Ark.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So you are a doctor of historian, geology, and theology. You are a speaker, author, and researcher. And I am representing Idź-Pod Prąd TV from Lublin, Poland. I'm here to ask you some questions from our church, from our community, from church.
Okay.
And they send me some questions. Some of them I make by myself, but some of them is from Lublin. So I have a first question to you. Is many see science and faith as a direct opposite. What is your view on this issue?
Well, everybody has faith. The atheist has faith. He believes God does not exist. The Christian has faith, the Muslim, the Jew. So right away we have a problem, because the scientific community, the majority of scientists, have essentially brainwashed the world into thinking that science is only possible within an atheistic worldview, and that atheism is not faith.
Yes.
But it is, because the atheist cannot prove that God does not exist. And scientists make all kinds of assumptions about the past, especially. And to understand this distinction, we need to understand that there are two broad categories of science. I like to call them origin science and operation science. Operation science is what we normally think of when we think of science. It's the science that is done by people with white lab coats doing experiments.
That's right.
And they're trying to figure out how things operate or function, whether it's cancer cells or two metal alloys that can be combined to make a stronger steel bridge or whatever. They're looking at things in the present and trying to manipulate those things to cure disease, to produce new technology. But that kind of science is not really affected by a person's faith, because you're doing repeatable experiments. So if you're trying to figure out what causes leukemia, it doesn't matter whether you're a Hindu, a Buddhist, an atheist, or a Christian. You're doing repeatable experiments. You're watching those cells reproduce or whatever. But the question of origins, the question of evolution versus creation, is in origin science. So whereas most of biology, chemistry, physics, engineering research, medical research, they're in the realm of origin science, operation science. Historical geology, paleontology, cosmology, paleoanthropology, those are in the realm of origin science. And there, we're looking at things in the present, whether it's rock layers or fossils, and we want to know what happened in the past to produce that rock layer. You can't recreate the rock layer in the laboratory. You can't recreate the Grand Canyon in the laboratory. You can't recreate the planet Saturn in the laboratory. And you can't recreate the creature that had those bones in the laboratory. So there, what a person's faith is about the existence of God, God's relationship to the creation, what their belief is about the Bible, whether it's mythology or a historical document, whether it's just man's word or whether it's God's word. All of those are faith issues that cannot be proved by any scientific experiment, and they have a huge influence on what people see and how they interpret it to reconstruct the unobserved past. So, for example, the first American geologist that went into the Grand Canyon in 1869, 10 years after Darwin published his theory, he was an evolutionist. He already believed in millions of years before he saw the Grand Canyon. So he was already believing whatever I see is going to be the results of millions of years. We have a geologist on our staff, Andrew Snelling. He has a PhD in geology. When he went to the Grand Canyon the first time, he believed that the Bible is the inspired word of God and it describes a global flood. He went into the same Grand Canyon, looking at the same rocks, and he was looking for evidence of Noah's flood. And we see the evidence. So what a person believes about God and about the past and what they believe about the Bible, either for or against, those beliefs cannot be proven by any laboratory experiment. They're religious or philosophical beliefs. They're not scientific. And they have a huge influence on a person's interpretation of the evidence. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense, yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So speaking of this, can we hold to geology and be faithful to creationism at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. The Bible is a book of history. 2/3 of the Old Testament is history. 1/3 of the New Testament is history. And the Bible describes a global, year-long, catastrophic flood. And if that event really happened, there should be an enormous amount of evidence. Just recently, the United States has been really hit by some major hurricanes. And they left evidence. The water that rolled into the homes in Houston, when that water leaves, there's evidence in those houses. There's dirt, mud. And so it's absolutely impossible. It's illogical that Noah's flood would happen and not leave any evidence. It would bury creatures in sediments. It would do catastrophic things, erosion, and as we really study the biblical text carefully, it indicates that there was tectonic, earthquake things happening in Noah's flood. And so the rocks of the earth are screaming Noah's flood. And the reason most geologists, including most Christian geologists, don't see it is because their minds have been trained to think using assumptions that come from an atheistic worldview. And so they look at the rocks and they can't see the evidence. An illustration that I use often helps people. I say, I was late for work one day and I needed to get to the office for an appointment and I couldn't find the keys to the car. And so I call to my wife and I say, Margie, I've looked in the office, I've looked in the bedroom, I've looked in the kitchen, I can't find my keys. I'm going out to the garage and see if I left them in the car. I come back, I can't find the keys. My wife's holding the keys. Where did you find the keys? She said they were in the office. Yeah, but I looked in the office. She said, yes, but you didn't look under the phone book on the desk in the office. Why didn't I look under the phone book? Because I assumed that they weren't there. So my assumptions kept me from seeing something. And most geologists assume that the Bible is mythology, or that Genesis isn't history, or that the flood was just a myth. They don't see the evidence for Noah's flood, but it's there staring at them.
Yeah, that's how you convert your thinking, your brain to think differently.
Yep.
Yes. Oh, thank you for this answer. Well, I have another question for you. Is what is your view about the age of the Earth? What do you have to say if people say that scientists have discovered rocks and skeletons that have been in existence for millions of years?
Well, the only way that you can measure the age of anything with any scientific process is to make assumptions. Let me illustrate. Let's say you come into a room and there's a candle burning, and you watch that candle for a minute, and you can see that the candle is getting shorter. Well, the question you want to ask is, how long has the candle been burning? To answer that, you have to make three assumptions. You have to first assume that you know how long the candle was.
Yeah.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
Second, you have to make an assumption that you've just measured how much the candle is shortening in the minute that you watched it. You have to assume that the rate at which the candle is burning now is the rate it's always burned.
Yeah.
But what if the wind was blowing before you came in the room and it caused the candle to burn more quickly? A third assumption is you have to assume that since the candle was lit, nobody has come in and put it out and then come back later and lit it again and then put it out. And so you have to make assumptions about the past. But you weren't there. So you don't know whether those assumptions are right.
Yeah.
And the dating, any scientific dating method, whether it's radiometric dating or any of the other methods, they all involve those three assumptions about the past, and there's no scientific way to prove that the assumptions are correct. So the only way that we can really know the age of the Earth is if there was someone who was there when it was formed and who was an eyewitness and said, I saw it happen and I'll tell you when it happened. And we have that.
Yeah.
That's God. And he wrote it in a book called the Bible. So the idea of millions of years developed in the late 18th and early 19th century. That was actually the focus of my PhD research. And it did not come from the rocks and the fossils. The idea came from anti-biblical ideas, assumptions of men who were deists or atheists, and they imposed those assumptions onto the geological evidence. And so they just assumed that it takes a long time for rock layers to form. They assumed that Noah's flood was either a myth or it only lasted 40 days and it wasn't very violent and it couldn't possibly produce a layer this thick.
Yeah.
Those were all assumptions, not scientific.
Yeah, true. They don't know the truth.
Right. So the world has been brainwashed with a lot of assumptions, and most scientists don't really know what those assumptions are, because in science education, students are not taught to recognize assumptions. They're actually taught to think that they're just letting the facts speak for themselves.
That's true. Because they are teacher. They teach you.
Yeah.
They know better than you.
Right. And they trust the teachers, and they trust what the majority of scientists say.
That's how we've been, actually. I was the same. That was my story with starting the school and...
Yep. And anybody who's studied the history of science knows that many times the scientific majority has been wrong. So, and truth is not determined by majority vote. So, but most people trust what the majority of scientists say.
Yes, yeah, that's it. Wow. How do you know how many years the layers of rock have, the deck of rock have? Can you answer this question?
Well, the Bible doesn't talk about layers of rock.
It doesn't talk.
So, but the Bible gives us a history, and it tells us very clearly that God created in 6 literal days, and that's what the church believed for the first 1,800 years of church history. That's what the Jews believed for 1,400 years before that. back to the time of Moses. And that's not just something that we just say we believe because that's what we believe. There are good biblical arguments for concluding that those days are literal 24-hour days, just like the days of our weeks. And then Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 give us genealogies from Adam to Noah and Noah to Abraham, and they tell us the ages of the patriarchs and how old each man was when the next man was born. And so we can add up the years, and it's about 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham. There's several verses in the Old and New Testament that give us the information to know that Abraham lived about 2,000 years before Jesus. We live about 2,000 years after Jesus. So the age of the earth is a little more than 6,000 years. The age of the whole universe, yes.
So all the answer is in the Bible.
Right.
As I'm speaking about the difference between evolution and creationism, what evolutionary aspect or argument persuaded people the most in this time? Or
the evolutionists control all the science programs on television, all the media, all the universities, all the public schools. So, I mean, they're just telling the world over and over again, evolution is a fact, millions of years is a fact, the Big Bang is a fact, and most people never investigate the arguments for how they arrived at that conclusion. And the evolutionists, there are some evolutionists who know what's going on, and I believe they're deliberately twisting things. But most evolutionists believe in evolution because they were educated to believe in evolution by someone who was educated to believe in evolution. And they've never personally investigated, and in any field of science today, the scientist is so specialized in one area that he's simply trusting what the rest of the scientific community says. So somebody can be an expert on cancer. That doesn't mean they know anything about human fossils or radiometric dating. Everybody's trusting everybody else because everybody who taught them had a PhD. And so it's basically indoctrination, brainwashing, and it's happening all over the world. I was speaking in Romania a few years ago, and I went to 5 different universities, and I went to a university where they got me into a biology class, and so I gave a lecture on why I reject Darwinian evolution, and there were about 30 students, and the head of the biology department and the professor for that class, they were sitting in the front row. So I gave my lecture, and afterwards, I had a discussion with the 2 professors. The students are not going to ask questions. They're afraid, the professors are here. So we have a nice discussion, and at the end of the time, one of the professors said, well, we admit that there are problems with Darwin, but the geologists have the evidence. Well, the next hour, I went and gave a lecture in the geology department and presented evidence for the global flood and the young Earth. And we had discussion. There were about 300 students and professors. And at the end of that session, one of the geology professors said, well, we in Eastern Europe, we don't all agree with uniformitarianism, and we accept catastrophism, and but the astrophysicists have the evidence.
Well.
So each department was claiming we got problems in our field, but the other fields have the evidence.
Okay.
And so they're just trusting the scientific community.
Yeah. Can creation and evolution get along? That's another. That like there is some aspect that geologists cannot explain, but creationists can.
Yeah, creation and evolution are completely contradictory views of the development of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't understand that evolution is actually a three-part theory to explain the origin of everything. So cosmologists talk about the evolution of stars and galaxies, the evolution of the solar system. And geologists talk about the evolution of the earth and the rock layers.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole story contradicts the Bible's account of creation
Mm-hmm.
and history and the flood. And there are a lot of Christians who try to fit the two ideas together, but to do that you have to ignore the details of the biblical text.
Mm.
The order in which God created things, according to Genesis 1, contradicts in dozens of ways the order that the evolutionists say things happen. You can't believe in a global, year-long, catastrophic flood and millions of years. The rocks are either the testimony to millions of years or the testimony to Noah's flood.
Mm-hmm.
Can't be both.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible very clearly says that Adam was made from dust and Eve was made from Adam's rib.
Mm-hmm.
You can't harmonize that with the evolutionary view
Yeah.
of man from apes.
Exactly.
So a lot of Christians are not paying careful attention to what the Bible has to say. Having said that, we need to be clear that natural selection is a fact. And mutations are a fact. And animals change. But natural selection only selects from what's already there.
Mm-hmm.
So if all the animals in the world died except alligators, those alligators could reproduce for trillions of years. They'd never produce a fish, a bird, a mammal, or a human being. Because there's no genetic information in an alligator DNA to produce feathers or hair.
Mm-hmm.
And so nature only selects from what's there. So that can explain how you can change a bacterium into a bacteriologist over millions of years. Mutations are a corruption of the genetic code, and they either cause a loss of genetic information or a shuffling of the existing information.
Yeah.
They don't create new information to make new body parts or new body functions. And so creationists believe in natural selection and mutation, but natural selection and mutations will not change a microbe into a microbiologist,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how much time you have. And so, but evolutionists,
They try to find the.
they deceive the public because they will give evidence of natural selection and say, see, that's evolution. It's not evolution. It's exactly the opposite. And they will talk about beneficial mutations. But those mutations actually involve a loss of information.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, there are beetles that have lost the genetic information for making wings.
Mm-hmm.
And those particular beetles do really well on the seacoast where it's windy because they don't have any wings to get blown off the rocks.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's not changing the beetle into something other than a beetle.
Mm-hmm.
And blind cavefish, they don't have eyes. That gives them an advantage. When they're swimming in the cave with no light, they bump into a rock, they don't get an infection. But that doesn't explain where eyes came from.
Yes. Well, evolutionism also believe that is something like microevolution.
Yeah.
Which is
That language is deceptive.
Mm-hmm.
Because what they argue is, well, yes, if we just have these small changes, but if we have enough time, the small changes can become big changes.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue is not the amount of change. The issue is, or the question is, the direction of change. And the issue is not change, but the genetic information to bring about the change. To change a reptile into a bird, you got to change the genetic information. To change an ape into a man, you got to change the genetic information. And natural selection and mutations or any other mechanism that evolutionists propose doesn't explain how you get new genetic information. So it's not micro versus macro evolution. It's the question of the origin of genetic information and how you can add the information to the genome so that a creature that only has information for making scales can become a creature that has genetic information for making feathers or hair.
Oh, thank you for this answer. We can talk about evolution and creationism all day or even longer.
Yeah.
But I have another question. I know you're gonna visit Poland next year. Is that right? For a conference in Lublin.
Yes.
Isn't it? And how do you encourage Polish Christians to attend on this conference?
Well, I would encourage them to come because they will hear information that they've never heard before, that the schools and the universities don't allow them to hear, that the science programs on television and the media don't allow them to hear. All of my talks are understandable to anybody over 11 years old. So people should not say, well, that'll be science, I won't understand. They will. But all of my slides are fully documented, so if a PhD scientist wants to come and he wants to dig deeper and check what I've said, he will be able to. So I've spoken in 25 countries and given these lectures, and so I would welcome not only Christians, but I would encourage them to bring their non-Christian friends and present both what the Bible has to say and what real scientific evidence says about these questions of origin.
That would be great.
Yeah. So I look forward to it.
We look forward to it too.
Yeah. Good.
Was a pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Terrym Mortensonem.
Good.
And thank you very much.
All right. I look forward to being in Poland.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Good.